Alright, I'm guessing that it was Mr. Spock in the engine room with the lathe. He said, "Live long and prosper," and then made sure they did neither. Hello interwebs, and welcome to my review of Star Trek Strange New World Season 3's long-hyped murder mystery episode, directed by none other than Riker himself, Jonathan Frakes, and titled A Space Adventure Hour. This has been this season's much-talked-about high-concept episode that Strange New Worlds has kind of been doing every year or so far. We had the musical episode last season, and we also had the fantasy episode way back in Season 1, and I've always been a bit trepidatious about these types of episodes of Strange New Worlds. For example, I wanted to love the musical episode. It's actually something I've wanted Star Trek to do for a while, but ultimately most of the songs kind of just ended up being forgettable pop filler, and the whole "our purpose is to fill our roles in Starfleet" message of the episode,
We know our purpose is to protect the mission.
just didn't jive with how I personally see Star Trek. Again, that's a me thing, doesn't have to be a you thing. And while I get why others like the episode, it just didn't really click for me. And on top of that, with these shorter seasons that we're now getting of Star Trek in the streaming era, giving one of these episodes away to a whole gimmick conceit can ultimately feel like it's eating away into valuable story time and into the identity of what the show itself actually is. I mean, back in the 90s, you could burn one of your 22 episodes a season on a baseball episode and still have plenty of time left for getting back to fighting space fascists in the next episode. But all that being said, those kind of like high concept one-off episodes are some of my favorites in their respective series. Like that aforementioned DS9 baseball episode is amazing. Or you have the James Bond episode, which featured the wonderful romance between Bashir and Garrick, now officially canon because of Lower Decks. Just don't at me about it. Let me have my Garshir. And then you also had episodes like Voyager's Bride of Chaotica, which is also top-tier camp. And even Strange New Worlds Season 1 episode Elysian Kingdom was a lot of fun. I mean, who didn't want to see emo wizard Spock? So I do love when Trek switches it up, as long as it still holds on to its own identity within that. And actually, speaking of gimmick episodes, we actually learned at Comic-Con this year that they're going to be doing a puppet episode in Season 4 of Strange New Worlds, very much continuing like the musical episode to pull from the Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel bag of tricks. Which I, again, also have mixed feelings on. It's a longer conversation, but I am always here for Star Trek being silly. But like I just said, them doing so many of these, especially with so few episodes per season, ends up reading a little bit like a gimmick, but I am willing to roll with it. Star Trek can be silly, Star Trek can be weird, hell yeah, let's give it a go, and ultimately it'll come down to execution. Ultimately, I'm okay with one episode of a season being a gimmick. It will just bother me if there's more episodes of Season 4 that end up being these gimmick style of episodes. So we'll just have to see how it goes. And Holodeck murder mysteries, on top of that, are also a classic Trek tradition, going all the way back to the Next Generation episodes like The Big Goodbye or Elementary Dear Data. And speaking of that, though, the other reason that this episode's gotten so much buzz is that it also features the return of the holodeck, like classic TNG-style yellow checkerboard walls and all, at least in live action. We did get it in Lower Decks, but, that was animation and they were cleaning out the filters, so. However, the return of this style of holodeck is odd because Strange New Worlds is set a century before The Next Generation, and the holodeck in that show was supposed to be brand new then. Why else did Riker look like a golden retriever experiencing autumn for the first time when he stepped into the holodeck in the pilot episode? So naturally, this has sent some canon nerds into full-blown warp core breach mode, and also probably triggered at least 3 outrage merchants here on YouTube to scream, "These writers have never even seen Star Trek," into a thumbnail or two. So, let me get into my spoiler-free thoughts up top first. Hey, before we actually get into the review of this week's episode, this is Editing Jessie here because I want to address criticism that you all had of my review of last week, specifically around my take on Ortegas's storyline. For some weird reason, I sort of just assumed that Ortegas seeing the Gorn in the reflection at the end of episode 2 of this season was overtly and obviously signaling the fact that she was under some sort of Gorn influence of some kind. I was kind of thinking of something similar that happened in Star Trek Discovery's first season, where we had Stamets looking into the mirror, and we see his mirror universe self sort of smiling at him. That was a sort of hint of the mirror universe storyline that was going to come later on that season, even though now thinking back on it, logistically, that doesn't make sense. Unless you're saying that the Mushroom Highway let them see each other through mirrors, which is weird. But regardless, putting aside Star Trek Discovery Season 1 wonkiness, I just sort of assumed, like, oh, they're saying that Ortegas is under some sort of Gorn control. Many of you last week pointed out, when I sort of made that assumption and just took it as read, that actually the storyline may just be that Ortegas is dealing with PTSD, and that was just a visual representation of her PTSD showing up, which I just sort of realized, like, oh yeah, that might actually just be the case. So I want to not take back, but sort of put an asterisk on a lot of my criticisms from last week's review. I still think a lot of them stand up, such as the fact that while I am very excited that Ortegas is finally getting a front and center storyline, I am a little bit saddened by the fact that the first storyline that she is getting is not us seeing who she is and what arc she's gonna go on just as a character in and of herself, but when she's acting quote-unquote abnormally, because she may or may not be dealing with PTSD. I am a little bit saddened by that, and also that it's a little bit reiterative of La'an's storyline of her dealing with PTSD from the Gorn. So there's a little bit of still some criticism that I want to be had if this is just simply a PTSD storyline of Ortegas. But that being said, if she is not under the influence of the Gorn in any way, I actually like this storyline a lot more. And I think that it's a much more interesting storyline for me to watch happen, of Ortegas, dealing with PTSD, seeing how it changes her, how it changes her relationships. I think that's something that we don't see a ton of in Star Trek. We get a little bit of it here and there, like Picard with the Borg, or even some characters on actually a lot of characters on Discovery dealing with PTSD and trauma. So I am very excited to see that taking place here. So I actually really hope that that is the case. But I will still leave it open that there may be some Gorn influence here, especially since we don't know all of the Gorn's powers, as we're clearly seeing with stuff like Batel and everything going on there with her. So at the very least, I'll say it's a little bit unclear what they intended, and I'm really hopeful that all of your reading that she's just dealing with PTSD is actually the reading, and if it's not, that they are able to do something interesting with potential Gorn influence. But I at least wanted to toss it out there because a lot of you pointed out, and I was like, yeah, I don't know why I naturally just assumed that was the case, that she was definitely under some sort of Gorn influence. I don't know why I just took that as like the obvious and only answer. So just wanted to put that out there for this review. And also, I should say, for those of you who mentioned that you were worried that I spoiled things for you because I get screeners, I've only seen up to episode 5 at this point, and at the time of when I wrote that review, I hadn't seen anything beyond that point. And so I will say I did not spoil anything for you because I actually don't know anything more about where Ortega's storyline goes, because it's, being saved for later on in the season, of which I haven't seen yet. Anyways, back to my review of this week's episode. I actually really liked this episode. It's easily my favorite of this season so far, though if you've seen my other reviews of episodes this season, that sadly is not a high bar, unfortunately. But this one is still a blast. The murder mystery is actually rather cute, especially because it centers La'an, who is one of my favorite characters on the show, and actually, gets us a little bit of insight into who she is and lets her loosen up a little bit. And without spoiling anything, because it's part of the fun, the actual murder mystery has a delightful Star Trek twist to it. This isn't just Data plays Sherlock Holmes and we get a sci-fi twist injected into the mystery plot, like Hologram Moriarty becoming sentient. Instead, the actual murder mystery itself is fully Trek flavored from the start, and it gives the Strange New Worlds cast as a whole a chance to play around in fun alternative roles, multiple in some cases, particularly Paul Wesley's case. But that said, I do wish that this episode had actually even leaned harder into Trek-specific lore rather than just the broad pastiche that it plays within. And no, I don't mean in the way that you think if you've already seen the episode. We'll get more into that in spoilers, though. Honestly, though, I think this could have been a great episode for Star Trek's 60th anniversary that's coming next year if they'd actually gone more all in on a specific angle that I'll talk about in the spoiler section. The mystery itself, though, is actually fun and actually features a few cute twists and actually a clever, if slightly underwhelming and anticlimactic, in my opinion, ending. And I also loved the Outside the Holodeck plotline that centered on Scotty, which doesn't exactly reinvent the dilithium matrix, as it were, but it is pure Star Trek, and finally actually gives Scotty actor Martin Quinn some time to shine, which I really appreciate. All that said, though, there is, and I think some of you already know what the thing I'm going to say is if you've seen the episode, one element that I really disliked here, and it's the one thing that is going to definitely carry into other episodes of this show. It is not the worst version of this storyline that I have seen, but it does tap into one of the major issues I've had with this season as a whole. If you know, you know. But overall, what I will say is while this episode doesn't quite reach classic status, it is a fun, playful, and rewatchable episode that unfortunately also has one choice that personally left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth. But your mileage may vary on that specific storyline though. All that being said though, it is spoiler time. So if you don't want the holodeck safeties turned off mid-program, now is the time to call for the arch and make your dramatic exit. Okay, now let's get into spoilers here. The opening with Paul Wesley doing his over-the-top Shatner impersonation on a really lovingly and really fun recreated original series style set is kind of frankly adorable. I genuinely laughed at the dialogue about melancholia, which is peak 1960s sci-fi nonsense, and the view screen just opening up into the next room without any like glass or anything there where the alien actor is just standing there is hysterical. I actually couldn't tell who the actor was underneath there. I wonder if it was like the Laan actress or something else. Like I'm curious who the actual actor was underneath all that makeup. I couldn't really tell. Let me know if any of you know. I also adore the sex puns. Dictation was great. That being said though, while I do like the parody on its own terms, I'm not really in love with the whole premise of this being a straight up 5-minute TOS parody as the opener of the entire episode. It drops us into it with zero context, which is a little disorientating. But more than that, my bigger issue is that this parody itself is pretty on the nose. We've seen this exact kind of original series pastiche and parody before. Saturday Night Live has done it, Galaxy Quest exists, Black Mirror has done it a couple times. The show Murderbot actually literally just did this just a few weeks ago with Sanctuary Moon. So I found myself wondering while I was watching this opening, what is this actually adding? And the answer kind of frankly is not much. And it gets even a little weirder when you consider that this is Strange New Worlds, which is a show already directly built off of the original series DNA. You know, it directly parodying the thing that you're actively reviving starts to feel a little incestuous, I guess is the word. And not in like a fun, self-aware way, more in a, wait, are we really like just looping back on ourselves at this point? Especially when you consider Akiva Goldsman has recently been talking about how he wants to do a direct original series reboot after Strange New Worlds ends, which, for the love of God, please don't do that. I enjoy Strange New Worlds for what it is, but can we stop after this show ends looping back on our own nostalgia tale, please? I will say Lower Decks, just to head off this criticism, I think does pull off a similar overt style parody with its Crisis Point episodes, but those episodes work because, first off, they're a wildly different style. The show is animated. And as well as those being kind of very wildly over the top and riffing on the dramatic high-stakes style of the original series Trek movies, not just parodying the exact format of a Next Generation TV episode that Lower Decks already kind of lives within. Like every episode of Lower Decks is already kind of pulling from the Next Generation. So if then they suddenly did a like overt pastiche of the Next Generation within Lower Decks, it would just feel like kind of weird and at cross purposes with what the show is. So the extra layer of separation of Lower Decks parodying the original series movies, which is kind of a very different thing from what Lower Decks itself is kind of pulling from, which is TNG, adds an extra layer of separation that makes all the difference here that Strange New Worlds with this opening parodying the original series doesn't really do or land for me. What does work, though, when it comes to that stuff is the bloopers that we get during the end credits of this episode. Those actually felt way more in tune with what this episode was actually really about, which is sending up not the original series as a show, but actually the behind the scenes of the 1960s era of the original series production. And that is where the episode shines, when it actually laughs more at what it took to make the original series more than it was laughing at the original series itself, because that's kind of been done a billion times before. That being said, though, I will say the original series style opening credits were a blast, and I adored the version of the Strange New Worlds theme song in a 1960s style. That was really great. I will loop back to the holodeck and the La'an of all of it in just a bit, but while we're already talking about this, I really did like that the murder mystery element of this episode actually revolves around the death of a producer who was trying to cancel the holodeck in-universe Star Trek style show. That is kind of actually a really clever meta hook that I really liked. Gene Roddenberry in real life definitely thought about murdering a few NBC executives in his day, at least metaphorically, I think. And I'm pretty sure some of them felt the same way about him, especially once Roddenberry started publicly trashing many of these producers on the college circuit when he was doing like big speeches in the 1970s after Star Trek had been canceled, and he was trying to, build himself up as the great bird of the galaxy, as he came to be known. Like, seriously, if you dig into the actual history of Gene Roddenberry, it gets so fucking catty. It's like Mean Girls, but with older TV producers. I love it. In fact, and I kind of hinted at this in my spoiler-free section, I actually wish this episode had leaned even harder into the specific Trek behind-the-scenes history. Maybe I'm biased. I've actually been deep in research for a big off-YouTube project that I can't talk about yet, but I have recently been reading a lot of books about the behind-the-scenes chaos of the original series through The Next Generation, and especially on Roddenberry himself. There's actually several interesting biographies about Roddenberry and the very complex person that he was. So maybe I'm too close to all of this and know too much, but I do wish they had actually found more ways to get more specific with the behind the scenes of Star Trek. What do I mean by that? Well, let me give one example. Where is the Spock character in this holodeck version of the original series? Spock as a character was everything to early Star Trek success in the 1960s. Nimoy became a sex symbol for many women. He became the breakout character of the show, so much so that it created real tension between Nimoy and Shatner on the set of the series. That was worked out later in their life. They had a very up and down dynamic as friends and colleagues, but there was real tension during the 60s between those two. And that dynamic between those two actors would have actually been a perfect setup for a murder mystery, right? These two people that, are kind of at each other as actors that may have killed this other guy, that would have been great for it. And then on top of that, there's also, Gene Roddenberry and his infamous behavior behind the scenes of the original series. His womanizing, the deeply uncomfortable pranks, quote unquote, that he pulled on the staff of the original series. Some of which were just straight up abusive. If you look into some of the pranks that Gene Roddenberry pulled, there's some kind of little messed up stuff that he did. And I get that, a Star Trek show is not exactly going to roast its own creator. But there is much more drama in what the actual history was that was kind of just begging to be woven a little bit more into this episode. And I think it's drama that most people don't really know. So this would have actually been a good way to show some of that history and done something beyond just William Shatner's parodies that Paul Wesley was kind of doing that have already been done to death a million times elsewhere. I mean, what I will say is, Anson Mount, for example, does a great job with his faux Roddenberry character here as a nerdy, self-important, awkward producer guy, but it feels more like he's playing a general 1960s TV producer archetype with a dash of Roddenberry seasoning on top, which, it's fine, but it also comes across a little safe and unspecific. Say what you will about Roddenberry, and there is a lot to say about the man. He did seem to genuinely care about Trek's ideals, even as he chased profit, fame, and women a lot of the time. He was a very contradictory guy. Mount's version here feels more like a type than a person. And I think all of this is why Celia Rose Gooding's big speech within the holodeck about how a show like Star Trek inspires kids to reach for the stars, to dream for the future, to feel seen, almost lands, but not quite as hard as it should.
You don't think some kid out there is going to see this show and spend the rest of their life searching the stars? You don't think a person can love a piece of art or music or a story so much that it heals them, shows them parts of themselves they've never even seen before?
I get what they were going for. And honestly, I think if this episode had aired next year in 2026 as part of Star Trek's 60th anniversary, it actually would have hit harder there. I wish this had been part of like season 4 of Strange New Worlds. But because this episode within itself only gestures at the original series instead of really digging into its specific history, the speech that Uhura gives ends up feeling a little bit contextless within this episode. Like, we watching as the audience, as Trekkies and as fans of Star Trek, know why Star Trek has changed lives over the many decades. But within this episode, it doesn't really sell why this fictional version of Star Trek would inspire people that way. And as a result, it doesn't really connect the two ideas as well. You know what I'm saying? Like, even if, I think what would have helped, let me give an example here. If there had been a moment where La'an goes and watches a scene, like an actual scene from the in-universe show that wasn't just, a William Shatner pastiche parody that we got at the top of this episode, was actually a moment where the show actually had a little bit of heart, something sincere and moving that came out beneath all the production nonsense between the 1960s, women in miniskirts and the actors' bravado and all of that. I think that would have gone a long way to say, like, oh, this is what Star Trek is. Like, has its problems. It's a mess of a production in the original series, but like, there are these moments of true transcendence. And we don't really get that. We also don't really even get stuff like even a mention of Star Trek's importance to representing a multicultural future, which, was kind of its whole big cultural footprint, at least in the original series. I think this episode could have done with a little bit more of a sweet, even saccharine moment that, would have kind of felt earnest within, Star Trek's overall optimistic tone. Something that reminds us why Star Trek endures beyond just it being fun sci-fi 60s stories. I think that could have helped Gooding's speech and point that the episode was trying to make about Star Trek land, I think, a little bit harder. That all being said, I've been critical here. There is some fantastic material here. Rebecca Romaine's character, who dies via poisoning, is clearly a blend of both Lucille Ball and DC Fontana, and I really, really love that. For those of you who don't know, Lucille Ball, obviously most of you know who she is, but she literally owned Desilu Studios, and she was the one that backed not only Star Trek as a series, but also Mission Impossible. And she fought for both of those shows to get on the air, and even fought to get Star Trek a second pilot. Like, without her, we would not have Star Trek. And, of course, she was right on both counts. Both of those franchises, Star Trek and Mission Impossible, are still printing money to this day. But she herself ended up having to sell her studio to Paramount because the shows didn't perform all that well at the time. So it was a woman making the right call and still getting screwed over, which is unfortunately classic Hollywood. And then DC Fontana was arguably the most important writer on Star Trek the original series who was not named Gene, either Roddenberry or Kuhn. She shaped Spock, the character, Vulcan culture, and contributed significantly to the show's emotional depth. And I kind of even wish we'd gotten a Gene Kuhn analog in this episode too, a kind of frazzled writing genius who was banging out scripts through a haze of stress and cocaine, but that probably would have been too much for the episode. So Una kind of representing both Lucille Ball and DC Fontana, someone who earnestly believed in the work but kind of was getting screwed over otherwise, I think really, really, really worked. The fact that she's the one who killed the producer until the holodeck decided otherwise and killed her to make La'an have a greater challenge was actually, I think, a pitch perfect and meta way to honor the messy, passionate behind-the-scenes history of the women on Star Trek. You can even point also to Jess Bush's character in this episode, who very much comes across as a version of Grace Lee Whitney, or any of the numerous Kirk romances of the week that we saw on the original series. Though, perhaps it's best not to dive too deep into Whitney's very real experience on Star Trek's set behind the scenes for a fun episode like this. Though certainly, I will say, if you don't know what happened to Whitney behind the scenes of Star Trek, it is very much a story worth elevating, and I've talked about it over in a video over on my main channel. But speaking of all the holodeck stuff, I really like that the premise of this episode is La'an being asked to test out this quote-unquote new holodeck technology. And I know, again, some fans are already spiraling over seeing a holodeck in the 23rd century looking basically identical to how it shows up 100 years later in TNG. It's very clear that the Strange New Worlds writers wanted to do their holodeck malfunction episode, which is a Star Trek staple, and so they just did it. But I think the way they did it actually thread the needle surprisingly well, because not only do we get the holodeck here, but they also connect it to the rec room from the animated series, which was doing holodeck stuff back in the early 1970s.
A swim at the beach?
And we also get La'an mentioning battle simulators, which is a slick way to tie in Star Trek Discovery's Season 1 holodeck-adjacent technology that we saw. The one where we saw Lorca and Burnham's wet blanket boyfriend having their shootout practice. That got fans all riled up at the time for it breaking canon for showing a holodeck pre the original series. Here, La'an explains that battle simulator as more rigid and limited technology compared to the holodeck's more adaptive capabilities. So, in one swoop, this episode connects 3 previously contradictory holodeck-style technologies across Trek canon and decades. And I think that's some damn fine continuity glue that even the most diehard Trek fan who lives to explain continuity breaks would have to nod in grudging respect towards. And La'an wanting a chance to play in her childhood detective fantasy was honestly super fun. I've been really enjoying how La'an has been opening up a bit this season. She's still the hardened, closed-off fighter that we met back in Season 1, which I like because PTSD and trauma don't just vanish after you beat your demons, even Gorn-shaped ones. But she is starting to let herself feel joy now and then after this season premiere. You know, this little moment of her playing detective for fun in private is kind of lovely and earned and feels right for her. Like, she wouldn't go and do this in front of all of her colleagues, but she would do it on her own or in front of Spock. Which does bring me to my major complaint for the episode, because let's talk about her and Spock. Look, I've gone off before about how every other episode this season feels like it's becoming Star Trek Love Boat. And I'm not anti-romance. A little shipboard flirtation is fine. I do not mind some romance in my TV shows. But everyone being in a relationship on the show all of a sudden starts to feel like the Enterprise is getting converted into a couples retreat. And this La'an Spock moment just doesn't work for me. If you're into romance stuff, this is no shade. Go off, kiss your Vulcan. I'm not here to yuck your yum-yum.
Yum.
It's just stuff that I don't personally love, generally speaking. But what I will say is, even beyond my general disinterest in romance plots, this one frustrated me on a deeper level. Because we've just spent 2.5 seasons with Spock tangled up in a whole love triangle between Chapel and T'Pring. And then we had him and T'Pring take a break last season, and then he just broke up with Chapel literally just 2 episodes ago, and we had this whole thing with him getting over her. And now all of a sudden, we're launching Spock into yet another romance already? And look, I don't hate the idea of Spock and La'an as a pairing. Weirdly, kind of works in my head for the two of them, but the pacing is just way too damn fast. I mean, 2 episodes ago, Spock and La'an were doing a dance class, and now all of a sudden La'an spends most of this episode flirting, kind of pseudo-flirting, at least hanging out with a holographic Spock, and then suddenly we're kissing Spock in his quarters. Again, in the exact same blocking as when Chapel kissed him last season. It's not just rushed, it's repetitive. And look, I'm putting aside for a moment how aggressively heterosexual this show feels. Like, we've got romances flying all over the bridge, and there's not a single queer pairing in 2025 in Star Trek. I mean, especially given the political moment that we're currently in, this kind of feels like a step backwards for a franchise that's supposed to be going somewhere better. But the real kicker for me is that there's no heat in any of these romances, especially not this one between Spock and La'an. There's no tension, there's no longing, no yearning, no buildup. Again, setting aside the homosexuality element of it, one of the reasons that so many people became Kirk and Spock shippers in the 1960s and why that became so popular for decades was because it was unspoken. Many people read into the glances, the near confessions, these like moments of unspoken feeling between Spock and Kirk as romantic. You may not agree with that, but like that is what kind of made it so juicy and what people wanted to dig into. That yearning is kind of where romance lives. It's why most, not all, but most of the best romances in TV are often the ones that are found through the chemistry of the actors and the writers discovering that these two characters kind of work together over the course of a few seasons rather than them just intentionally forcing it from the get-go. You know, but here though, Spock and La'an just skip the build-up and just go straight to making out. And it's again, not that I'm anti-romance, far from it, but if you're gonna do it, make me want it. Make the characters want it. Make me feel the pull. I need the juice! Why did I say it that way? Anyways, it's reading less like good romance and more like bad fanfic. And I know fan fiction writers who can do so much better than this. I mean, when did Spock, my socially awkward neurodivergent boy, suddenly become this fucking suave? All that being said, though, going back to the actual plot, I do actually like the reveal that the Spock that was helping on with the murder mystery was just a hologram. It's actually a clever twist that retroactively explains why Holo Spock was acting so emotionally flat the entire episode. And again, credit to Ethan Peck here. He plays Spock in all other episodes with enough subtle emotion that when it's gone, as it is with his performance on the holodeck, you start to feel that something's a little bit off. Again, it's such a nuanced performance, and Peck just nails it really well, and it like it's a subtle clue, but not a big one, so that it makes the twist at the end of the episode feel very natural, and you go, oh, that makes sense. That being said, though, what I will say is that twist does make the whole murder mystery plot itself feel a little hollow. Pun intended, since Holo Spock has no real motivation within the actual setting of the murder mystery, but is instead simply a suspect that the On wouldn't have immediately been suspicious of. It undercuts the Holodeck's in-universe storyline, the whole, we're killing the producer, this original series-style show that Anson Mount's Roddenberry character really likes. It kind of ruins the stakes that the episode had been asking us to invest in about these in-universe hologram characters. But still, I will say, it's a fun idea, the twist, even if the ending felt more clever than impactful, I guess that's to say. Oh, one other random thing that did bug me, though. At one point, Spock says,
"Well, as my ancestor, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, would write, the game is afoot." Which
I kind of dislike, because that line, if you don't know, is actually a reference to Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, where Spock makes a joke where he says,
"An ancestor of mine maintained that if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth."
Which is Spock referencing a classic Sherlock Holmes line. And the point of that original moment and joke in The Undiscovered Country was the ambiguity there. Is Spock joking? Is he claiming that Holmes, a fictional character, is his ancestor? Or does he mean Arthur Conan Doyle? You don't know, and that's kind of the fun of it. It was a playful nod to director Nicholas Meyer's Holmes obsession. Myers, if you don't know, has, written many books about Holmes and is a Holmes scholar. And it's mixing that with the fun being that the audience had to live in this weird meta gray area with that line. But in this episode, it just literalizes Conan Doyle as Spock's ancestor. And by doing so, it kind of undermines the original joke. Like, it's fine. It's not a problem, but it kind of like, it just kind of undermines what was kind of interesting and fun about that original line. But all that said, finally, I do have to say, I really liked the Enterprise side plot this episode. It was refreshing that the big problem that we're dealing with this episode, besides the holodeck malfunction, wasn't some grand alien threat, but just a neutron star throwing off radiation and messing things up. I miss episodes where Star Trek is just like, we found a weird anomaly, and now it's causing problems, like classic TNG vibes there. And I adored Scotty trying to fix the holodeck all on his own. His little moment with Uhura trying to casually pass it all off as a hypothetical problem and her immediately clocking him was adorable, and I loved it. I loved her saying, like, I caught on immediately. It was great. But honestly, my favorite moment of the entire episode was Una's talking to Scotty at the end about how he didn't need to have to do all this stuff alone. That moment actually hit harder for me than Celia Rose Gooding's holodeck speech about, the importance of Star Trek. Because not only did Una's speech to Scotty capture the collective spirit that I love about Star Trek, it was an ending to a plot that showed, rather than told us, how Scotty's brilliance isn't just about him being cleverer. The implication is that he becomes the legend, the wunderkind engineer that we all know and love in the original series, not just because he's smart, but because he also learns to lean on others. That is what Trek is about to me. That's the thing that I love Star Trek for. And so that ended up actually weirdly being my favorite plot of the whole episode. So again, at the end of the day, this was a fun, cute episode that overall I enjoyed, even if I wish it could have leaned a bit more into its truly clever behind the scenes of the original series Star Trek premise and the heart of what Star Trek means even more than it did in order to deliver us what could have been a really banger classic episode, as well as send up what made Star Trek endure for so many decades. But as it stands, it's a charming episode, but still a few steps short of greatness, especially given a romantic subplot that I already personally don't love on its face, and one that, even on its own terms, doesn't quite land the way I think it could have. But that's my opinion on this episode. I'd love to hear all your thoughts down below. What did you think? I'd love to hear all that. But beyond that, I hope you, my friends, live long and prosper.